I knew something was wrong the second I saw a roof where there had never been one before. Not a shed, not a fence, not some little backyard project. A full-blown wooden gazebo sitting out in the open field behind my house like it had always belonged there. The crazy part wasn't that someone built it. The crazy part was that they built it on my land, right beside a rural airstrip, inside one of the most heavily regulated pieces of property in the entire county. And what happened after that ended with federal inspectors, demolition crews, and a neighbor who learned the hard way that nobody uses that land anyway is not a legal defense. My name is Ethan Parker, and for almost 15 years I've owned a few acres outside a small farming town in eastern Kansas. It's the kind of place where everybody waves at each other, where tractors cause more traffic than cars, and where people generally mind their own business. The property wasn't fancy. No mansion, no lake, no luxury amenities. What it did have was space, peace, and a front row seat to one of the oldest airstrips in the region. The runway sat just beyond the back edge of my property. Most days you'd see crop dusters taking off before sunrise or small private planes stopping in for fuel. Occasionally students from a flight school about 30 miles away would practice landings there. It wasn't busy enough to be annoying, but it was active enough that everyone understood there were certain rules that came with living nearby. When I bought the land, I spent hours reviewing surveys, easements, and county records. One thing stood out immediately. The back corner of my property overlapped with a federally documented approach corridor for the runway. In simple terms, planes needed clear space while lining up to land. Because of that, structures in that zone were heavily restricted. Even trees had height limits. Every few years airport officials would inspect the area and remind landowners to keep things clear. It wasn't controversial. It was just part of life out there. For years nothing ever happened. My closest neighbors changed a few times, but everyone respected property lines. Then, about 8 months ago, the house next door sold to a couple named Trevor and Melissa Grant. At first they seemed pleasant enough. They were probably in their late 40s, recently retired from jobs in the city, excited about country living. The first few weeks were normal. We'd wave from our driveways. We'd chat about weather, local restaurants, things like that. But after a while I noticed a pattern. Every conversation somehow drifted toward the open land behind our properties. Trevor seemed fascinated by it. "Man, you've got the best view around here," he'd tell me. I could sit out there all day watching those planes come in. I'd laugh and agree. It was a nice view. But there was something about the way he talked about that field that stuck with me. Almost like he already considered it part of his backyard. A few months later I came home from work on a Wednesday afternoon and spotted several wooden stakes sticking out of the grass near the back corner of the property. At first I assumed the airport maintenance crew had marked something. Maybe drainage work. Maybe a survey update. It didn't seem important. The next day there were more stakes. Then lumber. Then concrete footings. By Friday afternoon an entire framework stood where there had been nothing but grass a few days earlier. I parked my truck and stared for a long minute trying to process what I was looking at. Over the weekend the project exploded. Workers showed up early Saturday morning. Nail guns echoed across the field. By Sunday evening there was a complete structure standing there. A raised wooden gazebo with railings, benches, decorative trim, and a tall peaked roof that rose above the surrounding land like a watchtower. I remember standing at my fence line with a survey map in one hand and a sinking feeling in my stomach, because I already knew what I was about to discover. The structure wasn't close to the property line. It wasn't near the property line. It was across the property line, several feet across, sitting squarely on my land. I checked the survey markers twice, then a third time. Same answer every time. That's when I realized I was about to have a conversation I really didn't want to have. So that evening I walked over to Trevor's house hoping this would all be some misunderstanding. Something simple. Something that could be fixed with one reasonable conversation. Looking back now, that's probably the last moment when this entire mess could have ended peacefully. Because the second Trevor opened that door, I realized he didn't think he'd done anything wrong at all. And what he said next completely changed the direction of the story. Trevor stepped out onto his porch holding a glass of iced tea like we were about to discuss lawn fertilizer instead of a structure sitting on my property. I remember trying very hard to stay calm because in rural communities, once neighbor disputes get ugly, they can stay ugly for years. I held up the survey map and pointed toward the gazebo. "Trevor, I think there's been a mistake. That structure is across the property line. He glanced toward the field, then back at me, and shrugged. Actually shrugged. It's only a few feet, Ethan. I waited for the joke that never came. A few feet onto my property is still my property. He smiled in that way people do when they've already convinced themselves they're right. Come on, nobody uses that corner. It's basically wasted space. That sentence hit me harder than it should have. Not because of the land itself, but because of what it revealed. He wasn't confused. He wasn't mistaken. He knew exactly where he had built it. He simply didn't think it mattered. I explained again that the property line was clearly marked and that the area was part of a protected approach corridor connected to the runway. That finally got a reaction, but not the one I expected. Trevor laughed. Actually laughed. It's a gazebo, not a skyscraper. Melissa appeared behind him and joined the conversation. She told me they had invested a lot of money into the project because they wanted a peaceful place to watch sunsets and airplanes. Then she added something that stuck with me. We thought you'd be neighborly about it. Neighborly. Apparently, in their minds, being neighborly meant donating part of my land without being asked. I left before the conversation got heated. As I walked back home, I felt that familiar frustration people experience when they realize logic isn't going to solve the problem. The Grants had already built the structure. They'd spent money. They'd shown it off to friends. In their minds, ownership had become less important than convenience. Over the next week, I tried the reasonable route. I sent copies of the survey. I highlighted the boundary markers. I even offered a compromise. If they wanted a gazebo, they could move it entirely onto their side of the property. Problem solved. Instead, Trevor doubled down. One afternoon, I found him sitting inside the gazebo with a pair of binoculars watching planes approach the runway. I walked over and asked if he'd reviewed the documents. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Ethan, sometimes people get too attached to lines on a map." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly. Clarity. Because until then I'd been treating this like a property dispute. But it wasn't just a property dispute. It was also an aviation issue. That evening I pulled out all the paperwork from when I bought the property. Old surveys, county records, easement documents, FAA approach diagrams. The more I reviewed them, the more obvious the situation became. The gazebo wasn't merely trespassing across a property boundary. Its roof sat directly inside a protected approach path leading to the runway. Height restrictions existed there for a reason. Pilots descending toward the strip relied on clear airspace. Even relatively small obstructions could create safety concerns under the right conditions. Suddenly I understood why airport officials had always taken those regulations so seriously. If I tried handling this solely through property law, it could drag on forever. Lawyers, hearings, surveys, appeals, months of headaches. But aviation regulations were different. Those weren't suggestions. They were safety rules. And safety rules tend to move much faster. The next morning I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer. Not to the sheriff. Not to county zoning. I contacted the regional aviation office responsible for overseeing airspace compliance around registered airfields. The woman who answered listened patiently while I explained the situation. I expected skepticism. Instead, she began asking very specific questions. Exact location, structure height, distance from runway centerline, survey records, property ownership. By the end of the call, she requested photographs and copies of the documentation. I sent everything that afternoon. Then I waited. Honestly, I expected the process to take months. Government agencies rarely move at lightning speed. But apparently words like unpermitted structure and approach corridor obstruction get attention. 8 days later, a white government vehicle rolled down the gravel road and parked near the field. A man named Richard Hale stepped out carrying a clipboard, measuring equipment, and the expression of someone who had seen every possible version of human stupidity. I introduced myself and walked him toward the structure. He didn't say much at first. He simply observed, measured, recorded notes. Every so often he'd glance toward the runway and compare something on a chart. Then he'd move to another location and repeat the process. After nearly an hour, he finally spoke. Who approved this? I almost laughed. Nobody. He stared at the gazebo again. That's what I thought. We continued around the site while he explained some of the clearance requirements. The details were technical, but the conclusion was simple. The gazebo failed. Not barely. Not by a little. It failed badly. Its height exceeded allowable obstruction limits for that portion of the approach path. Its location violated clearance standards. And because it also sat across a surveyed property boundary, it created multiple layers of problems at once. Before leaving, Richard asked one final question. Have the owners been informed? I nodded. Several times. He made another note on his clipboard. Then this next part probably won't surprise them. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived at the Grant's house. Then another from county officials. Then a formal notice outlining corrective actions. I wasn't copied on every document, but word travels quickly in small towns. Trevor was furious. The first time I saw him afterward, he stormed across the field holding paperwork in his hand. You called the FAA? He shouted. I reported an obstruction, I replied. You turned a neighbor issue into a federal issue. I looked at the gazebo. No, Trevor. You turned it into a federal issue when you built it there. His face turned bright red. For a moment, I thought he might keep arguing. But even he seemed to realize the situation had moved beyond personal opinions. Federal inspectors don't care whose feelings get hurt. They care about compliance. Over the following week, the pressure intensified. Additional site visits occurred. Measurements were confirmed. Documentation was reviewed. Every avenue seemed to point toward the same outcome. The structure had to go. The Grants tried arguing that it was only recreational. They argued that planes had never hit it. They argued that nobody had complained before. None of it mattered. Regulations don't disappear because someone thinks they're inconvenient. Eventually, the final notice arrived. The gazebo had to be removed immediately. Failure to comply could result in county-authorized removal and significant additional costs. I remember seeing Trevor standing inside that gazebo one evening, just before sunset. The same place he'd proudly shown off to visitors. The same place he'd insisted was harmless. Except now he looked defeated. He sat there alone staring toward the runway while a small training aircraft descended through the evening sky. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every conversation we'd had. Every opportunity he had been given to fix the problem voluntarily. Every arrogant dismissal. It's only a few feet. And that's when I realized the real consequences were finally about to begin. Because 48 hours later, trucks started arriving at the property, and what happened next became the most talked about event our little community had seen in years. 48 hours later, just after sunrise, I heard the sound of diesel engines coming down the gravel road. I stepped onto my back porch with a cup of coffee and saw 2 trucks, a flatbed trailer, and a small work crew pulling into the field. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was arguing. There was no dramatic standoff. In a strange way, that made the whole thing feel even more final. The decision had already been made. The paperwork had been signed. The inspections had been completed. Now it was simply time for reality to catch up with a choice that should never have been made in the first place. Trevor stood nearby with his arms crossed while the crew began working. I watched as they climbed onto the roof and started removing panels one section at a time. The decorative trim came off first, then the railings, then the support beams. Piece by piece, the structure that had caused months of tension began disappearing back into a pile of lumber. What struck me most wasn't how long it took to build or how expensive it probably was. It was how quickly something built on the wrong foundation could fall apart. By lunchtime, the roof was gone. By mid-afternoon, the floorboards were stacked onto the trailer. By sunset, there was nothing left except flattened grass and a few faint marks in the dirt where the posts had once stood. The field looked exactly the way it had before the Grants arrived. Open, empty, quiet. A few minutes later, as if the universe wanted to add one final cinematic touch to the story, a small single-engine airplane appeared in the distance. It lined up with the runway and descended smoothly through the approach corridor. No obstruction, no structure, nothing blocking the path. Just clear airspace exactly as it was designed to be. I stood there watching that landing and realized this whole situation had never really been about a gazebo. It wasn't even about the land. It was about entitlement. Somewhere along the way, Trevor convinced himself that because he liked something, because it improved his view, because the space seemed unused, the rules no longer applied to him. I've seen that mindset before. Maybe you have too. It shows up when people think courtesy is optional. Boundaries are negotiable, and ownership only matters when it's their own property at stake. A few weeks later, things settled down. The airport returned to normal. The field stayed empty. The county stopped receiving complaints. Interestingly, Trevor and Melissa eventually put their house on the market. I don't know if the gazebo dispute was the reason, but they moved away before the end of the year. We never became friends again, though we managed a few polite nods before they left. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if they had simply asked. Maybe we could have found a solution. Maybe we could have worked something out. Maybe none of this would have escalated beyond a simple conversation between neighbors. But they never asked. They built first and assumed permission would somehow follow afterward. That's a dangerous way to move through life. Because sometimes the land belongs to someone else. Sometimes the rules are there for a reason. And sometimes the person you're ignoring happens to have documentation, patience, and a phone number you really wish they didn't have. To this day, planes still pass over that field on their way to the runway. Every time I see one, I'm reminded that boundaries matter, whether they're property lines, safety regulations, or simple respect between neighbors. But here's the question I want to leave with you. If you were in my position, would you have made that call the moment you discovered the gazebo, or would you have kept trying to work things out even after being told those few feet of land didn't matter? Let me know down in the comments because people are surprisingly divided on this story. Some say I was protecting my rights. Others think I should have let it go and kept the peace. I'm curious where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real stories about property disputes, community conflicts, and the moments when ordinary people decide they've had enough.